somewhere over the Pacific. 1944. Japanese Zero pilot empties his guns into an American bomber. He counts the hits. 73 bullet holes tear through the fuselage. The wings are shredded. The tail is hanging by a thread. Fuel is leaking. Smoke is pouring from the engines. He watches, waits for the plane to fall. It doesn't. Instead, that destroyed aircraft, a plane that has no business staying in the sky, slowly turns toward home and flies 200 miles over open ocean with a pilot who should be dead at the controls. The Japanese pilot reported a kill. He was certain. Nobody survives that. He was wrong. What happened next is one of the most insane survival stories in aviation history. A story of one man, one wrecked plane, and a 200-mile flight that defied every law of physics and probability. Let's break it down. Before we get into the flight itself, you need to understand what kind of hell the Pacific Air War actually was. This wasn't Europe. In Europe, if your plane got shot down, you might crash land in a field. Maybe get captured. Maybe walk to friendly lines. You had options. The Pacific was different. Below you wasn't farmland. It was the ocean. Thousands of miles of empty, shark-infested, endless blue nothing. If your plane went down, your options were simple. You either got picked up by a rescue submarine or flying boat, or you died. Slowly. From exposure. From dehydration. From sharks. From simply giving up. American bomber crews knew this. Every time they took off from their island bases, they knew the ocean was waiting for them. One bad engine. One lucky enemy shot. One navigational error. And the Pacific would swallow them whole. Most of them were kids. 19, 20, 21 years old. Farm boys from Kansas. Factory workers from Detroit. College students who'd never seen the ocean before the war. Now they were. Flying combat missions over water that stretched to every horizon. The aircraft they flew were tough, but they weren't invincible. The B-24 Liberator. The B-25 Mitchell. The B-17 Flying Fortress. These were the workhorses of the Pacific bombing campaign. Big, heavy, bristling with machine guns, capable of taking damage that would destroy lesser aircraft. But 73 bullet holes? That's not damage. That's destruction. Now let me tell you about the pilot. I'm going to call him Lieutenant James. Some details vary in different accounts of similar incidents because there were actually multiple cases of pilots surviving seemingly impossible damage in the Pacific. But the story I'm about to tell you represents what these men went through. Lieutenant James was 23 years old. He'd been flying combat missions for 8 months. In Pacific Air War terms, that made him a veteran. Most crews either finished their tour or died before reaching that milestone. He had a wife back home, a baby daughter he'd never met. She was born 3 months after he shipped out. He kept a photograph of them in his flight suit pocket, over his heart, not for luck, for motivation. He wasn't going to die out here. He had people to get home to. The mission that day was a strike against a Japanese airfield. Standard operation. Fly out, drop bombs, fly home. They'd done it dozens of times before. The problem was the Japanese had gotten smarter. They'd learned to vector their Zero fighters to intercept the bombers before they reached the target. And Zeros were deadly. Light, fast, maneuverable, armed with 20mm cannons and machine guns that could tear through aluminum skin like paper. The American bombers had gunners stationed at positions throughout the aircraft with .50 caliber machine guns. They could fight back. But a bomber versus a fighter was never a fair fight. It was like a buffalo fighting wolves. The buffalo was bigger and stronger, but the wolves were faster and more numerous. The attack came 40 minutes from the target. 6 Zeros. They came out of the sun, classic fighter tactic. By the time the gunners spotted them, the first Zero was already firing. Lieutenant James heard the impacts before he understood what was happening. It sounded like hail on a tin roof. Then the screaming started. His tail gunner was hit. The intercom filled with chaos. Fighters. 6 o'clock. I'm hit. I'm hit. Where are they coming from? James threw the aircraft into evasive maneuvers. But a bomber doesn't evade like a fighter. You can't roll and dive and loop. You're too big, too slow, too heavy. All you can do is try to make yourself a harder target while your gunners fight back. The next 30 seconds felt like 30 hours. Bullets punched through the fuselage around him. His co-pilot took a round through the shoulder. The man screamed, grabbed his arm, and kept flying with his good hand. The instrument panel exploded. Half his gauges went dead. The smell hit him next. Fuel, hydraulic fluid, blood, and something burning. For a moment, James was certain they were about to become a fireball. Bomber fuel tanks were self-sealing. They had a rubber coating that would expand and close small holes, but that only worked for small holes. Enough bullets and the tank would bleed out or ignite. Then as suddenly as it started, it stopped. The zeros broke off. Maybe they were out of ammunition. Maybe they thought the bomber was finished. Maybe they had other targets to chase. It didn't matter. What mattered was that James was still alive, still flying, and very, very far from home. Now here's where the real story begins. James looked around his aircraft. What he saw should have made him give up. The fuselage looked like it had been attacked with a giant hole punch. He could see daylight through the skin of the plane. In some places, the holes were so close together that entire sections of aluminum were just gone. His tail gunner was dead. His radio operator was badly wounded. His co-pilot was flying one-handed, losing blood, and fading in and out of consciousness. 2 of his 4 engines were damaged. One was trailing smoke. The other was vibrating badly, probably a damaged propeller. His instruments were mostly destroyed. He had no idea how much fuel he had left. He had no idea if his landing gear would work. He had no idea if the wings would hold together. What he did know was this: the ocean was 10,000 feet below him. His base was 200 miles behind him, and he had 2 choices. He could ditch the plane now, put it down in the water while he still had some control, hope that the rescue services would find them before the sharks did, or he could try to fly home, 200 miles, in a plane held together by hope and twisted metal, with a wounded crew who would die in the water, with a co-pilot who needed a hospital, not a life raft. James looked at the photograph in his pocket, his wife, his daughter, and he made his choice. He turned the plane toward home. What happened over the next 2 hours defied everything engineers and pilots thought they knew about aircraft. Survivability. The plane shouldn't have flown. The damage to the control surfaces alone should have made it impossible to maintain stable flight. But James found a way. When the ailerons stopped responding properly, he compensated with the rudder. When the rudder became sluggish, he used engine power differential, running the engines on one side faster than the other to turn the aircraft. He flew that plane the way a wounded animal walks, limping, struggling, but moving forward. The smoke from the damaged engine got worse. James shut it down. Now, he was flying on 3 engines. Then, 2.5 engines started losing power, running rough, coughing, and surging. He adjusted the fuel mixture, nursed it, talked to it like it was a dying friend. Come on, just a little longer. Just get us home. His co-pilot passed out from blood loss. James flew alone. He had to. The navigator crawled forward from the back of the plane, stepping over the body of the tail gunner, and took the co-pilot's seat. He wasn't trained to fly, but he could hold the yoke steady while James checked charts and made calculations. 200 miles. At their reduced speed, that was nearly 2 hours of flying. 2 hours of wondering if the wing would fall off. 2 hours of watching fuel gauges that might or might not be working. 2 hours of listening to the aircraft groan and shudder with every gust of wind. The navigator later described it as the longest 2 hours of his life. He said he could feel the plane dying around them. Every vibration, every creak, every new rattle that hadn't been there before. He was convinced they would crash. But he looked at James, and James was calm, focused, hands steady on the controls, eyes fixed on the horizon. And somehow, that gave him hope. About 90 minutes into the flight, they spotted land. Not their base, a small island in the chain, maybe an emergency airstrip. James had a decision to make. Land now, on an unfamiliar strip, with unknown runway conditions, or push on another 30 minutes to his home base, where there would be medical teams waiting, where his crew could get the help they needed immediately. He pushed on. The last 30 minutes were the worst. The second damaged engine finally died. Now, they were flying on 2 engines. The aircraft was losing altitude slowly but steadily. James couldn't climb. He could barely maintain level flight. He was trading altitude for distance, gliding as much as flying, stretching every mile. When his home base appeared on the horizon, he felt tears running down his face. He didn't have time to wipe them away. He had to land this thing, and landing was going to be the hardest part of all. Here's the problem with landing a shot-up aircraft. Everything that makes landing work, flaps, landing gear, and brakes runs on hydraulic fluid. And hydraulic lines are just thin tubes running through the aircraft. Tubes that bullets love to puncture. James tried his landing gear. Nothing. The hydraulic system was dead. He tried the emergency release, a backup system that used cables and gravity to drop the gear into place. The gear came down. Probably. He had no indicator lights to tell him if it was locked. He was going to have to land on gear that might or might not be there, that might or might not be locked, that might or might not collapse the moment he touched down. He came in slow as he dared. The runway stretched out in front of him like a promise. He could see the fire trucks and ambulances lining the strip. Someone had radioed ahead. They were expecting a crash. He touched down. The gear held for about 3 seconds. Then the right gear collapsed. The wing dipped, touched the runway. The aircraft slewed sideways, scraping across concrete in a shower of sparks and screaming metal. It spun once, twice, and stopped. Silence. For a moment, nothing moved. Then James was out of his seat, dragging his unconscious co-pilot out of the wreckage, screaming for medics. The rest of the crew followed those who could walk, carrying those who couldn't. They got everyone out before the fuel ignited. For minutes after they evacuated, the aircraft was a fireball. But they were alive, damaged, bleeding. Some of them would never fly again, but alive. When the ground crew examined the wreckage, they counted the bullet holes. 73 confirmed impacts. And that wasn't counting the holes that had merged together or the sections of skin that had simply torn away. The aircraft maintenance officer looked at the wreckage and said 5 words that would become legendary on the base. This plane could not fly. But it had. 200 miles. On 2 engines. With a dead hydraulic system. With wounded crew. With a pilot who refused to give up. James spent 2 weeks in the hospital with minor wounds and severe exhaustion. His co-pilot survived. The shoulder would never be the same, but he lived. The tail gunner was buried with full military honors. The radio operator recovered and flew again. When James was discharged from the hospital, he found a letter waiting for him. It was from an intelligence officer who had interviewed a captured Japanese pilot. The pilot had described shooting down an American bomber near the date and location of James's mission. He was absolutely certain the bomber had gone down. He had watched it trailing smoke and fire. No one could have survived that damage. The intelligence officer thought James might want to know. Officially, he had been killed in action. According to the Japanese, he was dead. James kept that letter for the rest of his life. When people asked him how he survived, he always gave the same answer. I had people waiting for me at home. Dying wasn't an option. Here's what makes this story more than just an incredible survival tale. It's what it tells us about the human mind under extreme pressure. James did something that should have been impossible. Not physically impossible. Clearly, the aircraft was capable of flying home because it did. But psychologically impossible. When everything around you is failing, when logic tells you to give up, when the math says you're dead, most people break. They panic. They make mistakes. They give up. James didn't. And the question is, why? There's a concept in psychology called executive function under stress. It's your brain's ability to make rational decisions when your body is screaming at you to panic. Most people's executive function collapses under extreme stress. The amygdala, your brain's fear center, takes over. Fight or flight. Survival instinct. Rational thought goes out the window. But some people, and nobody fully understands why, maintain executive function even when they should be panicking. They can analyze problems, make calculations, execute complex tasks, all while their body is flooded with adrenaline and their lizard brain is screaming, "We're going to die." James was one of those people. In the moment when most humans would have ditched the aircraft, the safe, logical, recommended course of action, he made a calculation. His crew needed a hospital, not a life raft. His aircraft could still fly. The base was reachable. He ran the odds in his head and decided the risk was worth it. And then he executed. 2 hours, with unwavering focus, while his plane fell apart around him. That's not luck. That's not just courage. That's a kind of mental fortitude that scientists still don't fully understand. Some people are born with it. Some people develop it through training. Some people discover they have it only when they're tested. James discovered it at 10,000 feet, with 73 bullet holes in his aircraft and 200 miles between him and home. But here's the really interesting part. James wasn't unique. Throughout World War II, there were hundreds of cases like his. Pilots who brought back aircraft that couldn't fly. Crews who survived damage that should have killed them. Men who made 2-hour flights in planes that should have crashed in 2 minutes. The Pacific and European theaters are full of these stories. And they raise a question that military psychologists have been studying ever since. What makes the difference? Why do some people maintain executive function under extreme stress while others collapse? The answer, as far as we understand it, comes down to 3 factors. First, training. James had been flying for months. The procedures for handling emergencies were automatic. He didn't have to think about how to compensate for a dead engine. His hands knew what to do. When conscious thought becomes impossible, automatic training takes over. Second, purpose. James had people waiting for him. That photograph over his heart wasn't sentimental. It was functional. It gave him a reason to survive that was stronger than his fear of dying. Research shows that people with strong external motivations, family, duty, and responsibility to others, are more likely to maintain function under stress than people fighting only for themselves. Third, experience. James had been in combat before. He had been shot at before. He had been scared before. Each time he didn't die, his brain learned that fear doesn't always mean death. His stress response was calibrated by experience. First-time combat pilots often panic. Veterans often don't. Not because they're braver, but because their brains have learned that survival is possible even when everything seems hopeless. These 3 factors, training, purpose, and experience, are now central to how military organizations prepare pilots for combat. The goal isn't to eliminate fear. That's impossible. The goal is to build automatic responses, strengthen purpose, and create controlled exposure to stress so that when the real thing happens, the brain doesn't break. James didn't know any of this. He was just a kid from somewhere in America who didn't want to die in the Pacific Ocean. But his survival contributed to our understanding of human performance under stress. His story, and stories like his, became case studies. Data points. Evidence that the human mind is capable of more than we think. So yeah, 73 bullet holes, 200 miles, 1 pilot who refused to die. That's not a miracle. That's not luck. It's a demonstration of what happens when training, purpose, and experience come together in a human being pushed to the absolute limit. And if you think about it, that's actually more inspiring than a miracle. Because miracles are random. You can't replicate them. But training, purpose, experience, those are things you can build. Not for flying shot-up aircraft, hopefully you'll never need to do A. But for whatever impossible situation life throws at you. When everything around you is failing, when the math says you should give up, when logic says there's no way out, remember Lieutenant James. Remember that he looked at 200 miles of ocean and said, "I can make it." He was right. The question is, when your moment comes, what will you say? Now you know how one pilot survived the unsurvivable. And if you want to know about another impossible World War II survival story, the ship that fought off 23 German bombers with a crew of merchant sailors, that video is right here. This is the stuff they don't teach you in history class. But you'll remember it. See you in the next one.